All right, friends, welcome back again to another episode of Tactical Enlightenment. Our YouTube channel is dedicated to all things Bannerlord related, and especially advanced battlefield command and tactics. And we continue on with our special campaign here towards the very end of this Asserai campaign. If you missed the first episode, this is going to be very confusing to you because we are invading Russia, right? We are simulating Napoleon's 1812 invasion. We have a very large force here. We've taken some cities along the way. We have now crossed the Niemen River, and we are simulating the pursuit of Russian armies into Russia as they retreat. Right, Napoleon at this stage was seeking a pitched battle in order to twist the arm of the Emperor Alexander I to capitulate. After crossing the Niemen River, he anticipated a battle because he was in Russian territory, and so far the Russians were just retreating, committing to a burned earth, scorched earth strategy, right, burning out the grass and whatnot. Now we have peace with our good friend Guzid here. He's finally given us peace, even though I had to pay him a bunch of money, which is stupid, right? Because we could just annihilate him off the map if we wanted to. But that's the uber bad diplomacy system with Bannerlord. Now, again, we're going to continue our slow pace as we march along sort of a simulated path that Napoleon and his army marched with. You'll see occasionally, just like I'm doing right now, you'll see temperature blips on the bottom as we give you sort of a status update of where the army is. And again, we are simulating that we're following Napoleon's course here. Even the cities are named after icons that are located along the 1812 campaign. I've done my best to make this sort of a more or less a simulation of that. Of course, we don't have guns, we don't have cannons, and we don't have vivantiers, the cooks making food for the army, but we're going to do the very best we can. Of course, we got to keep our army cohesion up. We've got to do all the Bannerlord things that are necessary to make this work as well. And we're going to face random difficult things. Now, like I said before, we're going to self-impose some hardships because, quite honestly, the food system is way too generous. You can see right here, it says we could march for 15 years. Literally 15 years before we run out of food. 1,200 days, 80 days a year. Right, so we would run out of food in 15 years, which is stupid. So what we're going to actually do is simulate little checkpoints where effectively we take food from the army and simulate that the army is actually eating a lot more food than it looks like right now. Now, one thing we're going to add here, a little dynamism, is that I'm going to give myself a choice, right? This is like a choose your own adventure and then playing it yourself, of effectively giving more food to the troops or less at the peril of their health, right? And I'll explain that more in a minute. Now, I actually missed a checkpoint here. We're actually going to let go of 1,000 units of food here, simulating that, I guess we're going to say on summer 14, I've got my little checklist here. On summer 14, the troops consumed 1,000 items of food. I understand this is sort of herky-jerky. The reason I'm doing this is because I don't want every day to have to come into here and drop the food. So once a week, once a game week, we are going to have this food penalty, and I'll explain that more in a minute. In fact, I have a little graphic that I'm going to create to essentially show you guys the 3 choices I have of dealing with that food. Now, of course, we've got to be careful how much food we give to the troops here. And this was a real life consideration, right? Somebody somewhere in Napoleon's army made the decision how much food all the units got, right? And I'm going to be doing something similar here. We got a couple companions to add to the army here. And again, we're going to continue to ramble and talk about this stage of the campaign. If you didn't see the first episode, again, we're going to move very slowly here because I want to talk about some of the difficulties that were being faced by the Grand Armée as they marched into Russia. One of the things they experienced right away in the area that we're in right now, and it's perfect, near Vilnius, is forest, and their horses started dying en masse. Basically, there were hundreds of thousands of horses, everything from pulling supply wagons to carrying troops, and there wasn't enough grass. They were walking through deep forest, and anybody who's been in the forest will tell you there's no grass, right? Or hardly any grass, right? It's just there's not enough sun, so the grass doesn't grow, and the horses were starting to starve and die at a rate of something like 500 a day. Eventually, it exceeded 1,000 horses a day that were dying. So just a total maelstrom of logistical concerns. Part of the reason that things were difficult, I'm curious too, if the Aserai are at war. The Aserai aren't at war with anybody. The Aserai are now sort of our uneasy allies. There's a chance they declare war on us, and I may just leave that be as is, because of course the Austrians eventually became Napoleon's enemy. Look at this little fog system here. And I will bring up weather as well. That'll be perfect if at Smolensk we have like a crazy foggy battle, because you have all kinds of weather affecting the campaign as well. But just to give you an idea, there was a thunderstorm in late June that just caused torrents of rain and huge fucking disasters. Literally, people were killed by lightning. And then the wagons would run through this mud, and they would create just a gigantic mess of mud. They actually have a term for it in Russia. I think it's called Rasputita. And it's basically, that stands quite literally for the season of mud, where it rains heavily, and obviously before you have paved roads, before you have nice cobblestone roads like the English have, you just basically have a giant fucking mud pit, and you're trying to bring through tens of thousands of wagons and horses and hundreds of thousands of people. It's not going to go well. So horses were getting stuck. You'd have carriages and wagons get stuck in the mud, and then of course nobody could get around them, right? They would have to go into even deeper mud or whatever it was, try to help them out of the mud. Horses and troops at the front of the army could not eat because the supply horses at the back of the army could not keep up with them. There was all kinds of disease. The troops and the horses were experiencing disease, and of course starvation. So talk more about the food here in a little bit. What you need to know in the short term is that I am gathering all the food up from these villages. In fact, we will go ahead and show, I'm going to show this a couple different times. I'll flash it a couple different times here. Understand I'm doing this with after editing. What we're going to be doing is essentially giving me 4 choices on how much food I want to give the troops, right? We're going to either give them... and these are, again, simulations. Either give them lots and lots of food, right? The maximum amount, in which case we will suffer less casualties, less desertion. We can give them a meager amount of food, right? Less food, at which point, of course, desertion and whatnot goes up. And I want to... I got to make sure these troops don't desert here. I'm going to be dropping troops periodically, and of course we're going to try to drop the least valuable troops, right? That was often the case, ironically, because your deserters were oftentimes like militia and poorly paid or not paid at all troops being mistreated. So other options I have as a commander as far as food is we're going to have half rations, basically telling the troops, we don't have enough food to give you your full food rations. And you can imagine what that does to morale, right? That's very bad for morale, and there's a consequent loss of troops. And then the final category is no rations at all, and that may happen towards the end of this campaign if we simply run out of food. We will lose morale. We will start to suffer the mass desertion of troops, of course, because if you're not feeding dudes and telling them they got to keep marching every day, you got either disease, desertion, or very hardy motherfuckers. So again, I'm going to hit all these villages. I'm going to take advantage of all these little villages. And again, there's a little bit of a game being played here. Anybody who played like the original Oregon Trail, it's kind of a similar idea, right? You've got all these resources and you're trying to balance them, and you're suffering effects of health, right? It's very difficult to travel dozens or hundreds in some cases of miles as they were on the way to Moscow. And there are consequences to that. So ironically, actually, I'm going to do it, I think, right here before Smolensk. We're going to go through one of these decisions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give up 2,000 food. In other words, I'm going to feed my troops at the highest rate here and suffer 50 deserters, right? Basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to freeze it right here, right before we siege. I will dump off 50 troops, preferably the worst troops we have. Of course, later on, we're going to have to actually dump good troops because we're simply going to have desertion is going to increase. I can just assure you that's going to happen, right? I've done the math. Even if I'm cautious with my food here, it's going to be difficult to keep the army from having desertion. Now understand the baseline level, there's desertion, right? Even if we feed our troops well, which is what we're doing here, we're feeding them 2,000 extra units of food per week, and we're still getting 50 deserters. And part of that's happening because I'm trying to combine that combo. The word, essentially it's desertion and disease, right? Disease is not calculated in Bannerlord, and the French were suffering huge waves of typhus and all kinds of other communicative diseases because, of course, these troops are sleeping right the fuck next to each other all day, every day, fucking pissing right where you sleep and stuff like that, having all kinds of consequences of that. So just to understand this process, again, it's artificial, of course, right? This whole campaign is artificial, but play along with me here, add a little bit of imagination. Understand at this stage, I'm choosing to feed my troops very well and trying to minimize desertions. And this is why, I mean, holy shit. Okay, I see what's going on here. This Valandian city, this city has 2 or 3 other armies that are not Valandian, so they don't show up. This fuck here, Beatrin or whatever, they don't show up. Of course, they have tons of archers and fiend champs. At all. They don't show up on the list until you siege it. Fortunately, they didn't sally out at us. Well, I don't know. Maybe it would have been easier if they sallied out. But either way, that just means we're going to have a brutal siege here of Smolensk. And actually, that's perfect. I was a little worried that this siege might be easy. We just blast through Smolensk in a 900-person garrison. But because the Valandians have so many troops, and of course we're at war with 4 different kingdoms, all of the armies that are inside this city are effectively participating in the siege defense. So I'm going to sit up here. In fact, this is going to be difficult. And this adds to the difficulty. And what I mean by that is this adds to the attrition. The war of attrition is a word most people have heard of. Bannerlord does not do a really good job of sort of simulating the war of attrition, again, because there's no disease, no desertion. That's going to play a major impact with us here. As we enter, by the way, I want you to notice the date as I continue to scroll the temperature and the changing weather. That's going to have an effect on this campaign, and particularly it started to have an effect on Napoleon almost on cue. Again, I have no control of the weather in the game. You're going to see it rain sometimes, and I'm going to be telling you it's sunny. I'll try to make sure that the after editing sort of corroborates with the. I'm going to try not to make it pouring rain and then I'm going to say 86 and sunny. I'll do my best to make it the same, but understand that the weather really started to affect the Napoleonic campaign in what is now effectively late summer, early autumn. Right, Russia, of course, summer doesn't come when it comes in like Georgia or parts of Spain. Fucking winter comes in October, right? And fall, of course, starts in September just because of the how north they are. It's a very cold climate. I did research weather both on the actual campaign itself. I'm a weather nerd, so I actually spent a good amount of time just literally studying the annual normal temperatures of places like Minsk and even Smolensk, right? So we've done our homework for this. None of this is perfectly super accurate. I did correlate some storms and whatnot from eyewitness accounts, but just understand right now it's raining and we are simulating the French siege of Smolensk. Now I should tell you a little bit about the siege of Smolensk here before we jump into this battle and what a battle this is going to be. The French were trying to trap and destroy the Russian army for literally a couple hundred miles, from all the way from the Niemen River to Smolensk. And Napoleon was very frustrated by this point because he expected to have a major pitched battle. In fact, he's quoted as saying he thought the whole campaign was going to be over in 6 weeks. Well, we're past 6 weeks already, so you can picture Napoleon being very uncomfortable. I believe the date of the siege of Smolensk was August 16th through 18th. So the siege of Smolensk, the Battle of Smolensk, the Russians retreated into Smolensk, which was a large city, and it also had what was called the Smolensk Kremlin. And if that's a word you're familiar with, of course it is. That's because Kremlin in Russian essentially stands for a barricaded or a reinforced fort, right? A citadel. All right, so the French are attacking the Russians inside Smolensk, and it's a very bloody, messy battle. There was fires set by some of the exploding ammunition rounds that the French sent. The French didn't have siege weapons because they did not anticipate a siege. A lot of times people think of Napoleon, oh, he's a genius. Everything must have gone brilliantly. He probably had fucking everything all set up, and the guy had the tunneling guys or whatever, the guys that would dig tunnels underneath walls, and sappers and whatnot, and just blow up the walls, and the French go in, hardly any casualties, and everything went fine. Well, it didn't go fine, right? The Battle of Smolensk was very ugly, and it was very unprofessional, very messy. The French had no ladders, and so they basically set the city on fire and then approached the city in an all-out guerrilla, swarming a zerg. French troops were charging like through rivers and shit like that. There's eyewitness accounts, of doctors getting their arms shot off because, of course, they couldn't even protect the doctors. It was a super messy, bloody battle. The French lost something like 8 to 10,000, and maybe the Russians lost something like 8 to 15,000. Just know, though, that this simulation here, obviously it's not the same, but we are on a time level roughly about the spot where Napoleon and the French armies are battling it out for the city of Smolensk, right? Smolensk was a highly important religious city in Russia. It was a pretty large city. I want to say it was 20 to 50,000 people, right? And back in that era, that was a pretty good sized city. They had some very important religious icons there, and so the Russians turned to give battle. Now, it was very temporary. It was a battle for a day or two, and the Russians got out of Dodge, right? One of the most important things the Russians knew is they couldn't have their army destroyed. They couldn't afford to have Napoleon capture and annihilate. Annihilate means completely, gone to the last man. They couldn't afford to have the Russian army destroyed because Napoleon would win, right? So they were trying to continue this war of attrition, tire Napoleon out, tire this French army out, basically have it, lose troops to disease and lose troops to lack of fodder and stuff. That's why the Russians committed to the raised ground tactics. I have a little bit difficulty here trying to keep my narration coherent as I also do tactics. Bringing up these units, we're going to swap this side here. Unlike that amateur Napoleon, we're actually going to bring ladders to our siege. I digress here, of course. Napoleon wasn't anticipating a siege. But we're going to assault this city from this right side with siege towers, with siege ladders. And now I'm going to start to take our main sort of juggernaut force to the left, right? We're going to use all these troops and assault them at the siege tower. Now, before we do that, I've gotten a kick lately out of manning these catapults. And one thing you can anticipate, right? If I should have said this before, strap yourself in. Although if you're watching these episodes, right, maybe you can just sit down gently. It's not going to be that exciting. Although who knows, right? This might be a really bloody siege. It's sort of shaping up like Smolensk, right? Except we have ladders. We're going to burn this city and lob some fucking flaming rounds in here and start fucking catching the city on fire. That's not really a thing in Bannerlord. You can't actually light shit on fire, but there's certainly some similarities here, right? This is an important city for the Valandians, and they are defending it. They've got some help, and they're not backing down. Now, it takes me a little bit of while to get these cannons, get these fire onagers dialed in, right? We're cannons. I'm in Napoleon's mindset here, but I've learned to just make very subtle changes like that. That way you can avoid most of the friendly fire and then obliterate. Let's see. Let's stay on these ladder boys for a little while. Basically, all I'm trying to do here is, of course, wear out the troops that are on the wall defending the ladder, right? The enemy puts a bunch of troops up there to try to stop your guys coming up the ladder, and we're just giving those fellas a hand. Now, we're going to hit some of our own troops. That's inevitable, right? But I'm trying to minimize those casualties. When Napoleon's army smashed their way through Smolensk, they did so kind of rudely. And what I mean by that is they paid absolutely no attention to civilian buildings, civilian structures. They didn't intentionally blow up churches and shit like that, but they essentially destroyed this whole city, this wholly important city of the Russians, paid no attention to civilian losses. And it was sort of, I don't want to say it initiated, but it was at the start of when warfare was really changing between the 1700s and, of course, World War I and II, where civilians the armies no longer paid that much attention to civilians, right? Just like that, we get some friendly fire. The French were basically just like, fuck it. If these civilians are in the way, they can get blown up too. We have an objective here, and of course, both sides really did feel like that they were on the right side of history. The French felt like they were trying to bring the Enlightenment and bring modern sort of progressive culture to Russia and other obstinate fucking feudal feudal kingdoms, and of course those feudal kingdoms all just cloaked themselves in religion and said, go fuck yourself with your enlightenment, right? Obviously, you know kind of which direction I tend to lean towards, given the name of the channel. Obviously, America and most United States and most Western civilizations at this stage have embraced something kind of like what Napoleon was ushering in, right? Democracy, the idea of a fair legal system, etc., etc. All right, so Smolensk is being burnt to shit. The Russians left themselves a back door, though. And I must admit here, a little correction. What do they say on TV? I have to make a correction. Last episode, I said it was General Bennigsen. Bennigsen wasn't involved in the early stages of the Russian campaign in 1812. It was Barclay de Tolly, is the guy's name. It's kind of an awkward name. I almost prefer to use Bennigsen. It's not that important, but just in case there's a history buff out there slapping me with their ruler, or however the fuck that works. I was Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration. I did have the name, if not perfectly accurate, pretty close. All right, now we're going to start assaulting on this left side, right? Both sides have been thoroughly softened up, right? We've lit the city of Smolensk on fire here. We've softened the defenders considerably. I actually did pretty well there on a siege catapult. Now we're going to bring up this 7th and 8th Corps, these reserve units, and assault the walls, right? These guys mostly have javelins and arrows. The 8th Corps is our best units. That includes some of our high-end companions. We've got 2 infantry divisions and an archer division leading the way ahead of us here on the siege tower, and it's time to really start making some hay. We're really sort of, at this stage, we're systematically shredding this city. The defenders up there are just being completely lit on fire. I mean, look at that shit. Nobody's going to survive that shit. And, of course, we've got all these Palace Guards and Asteroid Vanguard Ferris just waiting for their turn. So far, so good. Now, keep in mind, right, 3,100 defenders, right? So this is going to be a little while. This is not going to be over in 3 minutes. A lot of people, of course, when they play Bannerlord, a significant siege assault for them is 800 against 500. This is literally 4 or 5 times as big as that. So it's a gigantic siege, and it's going to take a lot of blood before, before these Russians vacate the city. So that's an important thing to know. The siege of Smolensk, the Battle of Smolensk, was an attempt by the French to trap the Russians. There was another missed opportunity by one of their marshals. I can't remember the guy's name. Napoleon was fucking furious. But basically, the French had a plan to trap the Russians. It failed. The Russians escaped, but not before the city was destroyed, and there was major damage done to both the French and Russian armies. Of course, in traditional propaganda style, and if you don't know this yet, as we wait here in this medieval traffic jam, I can't fucking move because there's 80,000 troops ahead of me. It's a traffic jam. Get up there, boys. Start attacking. If you don't know, Napoleon was a master of propaganda. And propaganda is a nice word for lying. That's basically what that shit means. Napoleon routinely would write sort of dispatches. He would write his own news report after a battle, whether it was the Battle of Marengo or some of the other battles, and he would exaggerate in his favor all the battle casualties, right? Because one of the things that's important to remember is that Napoleon really was a usurper. He seized power. He had no legitimacy. He was definitely not, by any means, authorized to just take charge, take the entire French kingdom, under his command. But that's exactly what he did. Now, to be fair, I am not a royalist. I despise the concept that these stupid fucks think that they have hereditary rights to run a country just because they're some son of some fucking duke or whatever the fuck. Don't get me wrong. But Napoleon ultimately, the point here is that Napoleon ultimately was a usurper. If you're not familiar with that term, it basically means somebody who illegally or wrongly seized power. And in order to back that up, he basically painted himself as this incredible god of war who nonstop had success, and thereby was destined by fate, right? By whatever god, whatever you believe in, to be the leader of France, right? He was the whole time, every single battle, or most of the battles, he would exaggerate his successes so that his successes that were already impressive just looked incredible. I think at Smolensk, he said there were 700 French dead when they actually lost like 9,000. Just to give you a little example. Now, our troops are trickling up here. This is a frustrating process. It wasn't too long ago that we had another siege that was very challenged from, I guess you would say, just a game game mechanics, right? The bottom line is these troops aren't coming up this siege tower quite as fast as they should be, so we will kind of deal with that here. The guys at the front gate don't look like any chance of getting through there. There's 900 troops there defending vigorously, so we'll see if we can't get a better vantage from up here and try to get some troops inside this city. This is what I meant. This city defense is hardly over. Look at this. The enemy's pouring in archers here. In fact, I get myself into trouble on a regular basis. Usually I get killed in sieges like this. Guys are fucking chasing me down and shit, slashing me in the head. Catch a javelin for that insolence, motherfucker. And of course, you know, here's my reinforcements. It's one dude. Charge! Me and this guy, we're the reinforcements, I guess. Again, because the game mechanics very frequently... and please, some modder help this shit. Troops get stuck on the ladders. They get stuck on little angles on keeps. They get stuck on siege towers. And you as a battlefield commander have to deal with essentially maximum difficult scenarios. So I'm getting fucking assailed here and chased. Meanwhile, I see 9,000 troops outside the gate. You know, we had this same problem not too long ago. I'm trying to remember what castle it was. But a very similar situation. And look at this shit. I told all of these archers and whatnot to rally up here, and there's like 40 guys. There's 2 or 3 down there. Even though I'm pointing hundreds of them to get up here, these guys are really having a hard time getting to the walls. So, in some ways, this is very much like the siege of Smolensk, right? I think it's really interesting to think about that concept, especially with guys like Napoleon, right? You think of like this brilliant... this brilliant plan and all this flanking and deception over here, and we're gonna use cannons at this angle and use the smoke of the cannons, and like the stupid movie here, we'll cover these troops with a sheet and nobody's gonna know they're there. I mean, my fucking 8-year-old niece can see that there's fucking somebody sitting underneath the sheets, but evidently these hardened warriors, you know, have no clue. Look at these troops are all falling down here, just getting cut apart. That was hilarious looking. I might slow-mo that if I can remember that. But I think it's really interesting to sort of picture the siege of Smolensk. And remember that Napoleon is not that far upgraded from a chimpanzee, right? We're just chimpanzees with cannons, nuclear weapons, and philosophy. And here is Napoleon, you know, this incredible guru, warlord, war kingpin, war leader, and they really did kind of butcher their ways through Smolensk. They didn't have any kind of siege ladders or towers or rams or anything like that. The troops were basically forced to charging through the water and doing makeshift things to get over the walls. And you get a picture of sort of chaos, guys being shot on both sides, men yelling, orders being ignored as chaos reigns the day. And it's almost a little bit of a preview of what's to come in the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. Of course, again, I don't want to blow too many of the interesting moments that are going to occur. Again, I really do think it's one of the most amazing episodes in history. And what I mean, oh shit, we're getting closed in here. The enemy's totally hemming us in. See, I'm butchering this siege assault too. Part of the reason is we don't have any fucking reinforcements for some reason. I'm gonna fight our way through this. Fucking assholes. And get back to our reinforcement spot. There's some guys in here, but you can see this enemy's gonna defend this city like fucking rabid dogs. Out of my fucking way. I will not be denied. Wazuban rages when he's fucking getting hemmed in. And then when Wazuban rages, people die. So it's really interesting picture for me anyways. I'll wrap that point up. To imagine, you know, this incredible guru, almost a legend, right? He's almost mythical. Napoleon, this incredible war general. And lo and behold, what happens right at the siege of Smolensk? It's this free-for-all with freelancing. And it basically is just a total ghetto engagement with troops chaotically assaulting over here. And troops getting stuck in the water over there, trying to get up the walls, being shot down by Russian defenders, and a general scene of chaos and disorder, right? Even though, again, you have some of the preeminent war leaders in the whole world participating in this campaign, whether it's Marshal Davout, who's unquestionably one of the best generals, marshals of the time, Napoleon, Kutuzov, all of these brilliant war leaders, and you still have chaotic, messy moments like Smolensk. That's what's happening here. Now, of course, one of the themes I've been emphasizing this whole time is that this was a war of attrition. Napoleon repeatedly is on record saying that he thought the whole invasion would take 6 weeks. They crossed the Niemen River sometime towards the end of June. I want to say it was June 24th. That means that by early August, Napoleon expected to be sipping champagne and clinking his glasses with his fucking smug troops and smug war leaders after the Russians capitulated like a bitch and gave him Ukraine and whatever else Napoleon demanded. And obviously Russia had a very different opinion. There were previous instances too. I want to put this point in. Prior to World War II, obviously Hitler also tried to invade Russia in the winter, found out that this is not an easy thing to do. There were previous instances before Napoleon of people trying to invade Russia and not having a particularly good time at it. This fucking siege tower must be bugged. I feel like fucking destroying it. Wazuban is getting angry. Look at this shit. I've got these troops being told to get up here, and there's nobody coming up the siege tower. So, and again, I narrate these live. You guys don't get to see this very often. This time, I'm probably going to include it, right? Sometimes if I have a bugged siege, I just don't include it in the campaign. They don't happen very often, but look at this shit. There's 8,000 guys here. Look like they're lined up for the food bank. And there's one or two guys bugged and shit trying to climb up the siege tower. Totally fucking with my plan here, right? I'm starting to feel like Napoleon, and the only thing I can do is just F1, F3, and then get killed like a dipshit trying to attack by myself. These guys over here, of course, are evidently incapable of lifting the ladders on their own. And this, again, I've talked about this before, it perfectly encapsulates what a beautifully, maddeningly frustrating game Bannerlord is. This game, by all accounts, is like the best football player, and I'll just use that analogy because it works for Europe or the America, right? The United States with the NFL. It's like the best football player on the planet, and he's a drug user and can't stop using drugs. It's like, what fucking lost potential? Bannerlord really could be like one of the greatest games ever made, and instead it's just a really good game because they just didn't finish and didn't work out some of the kinks. Now, admittedly, we're using tons and tons of mods here. There's definitely a chance the battle size mod is causing all kinds of problems with the game engine. I've been in plenty of sieges before and things work just fine. These guys use the siege towers. I've fought hundreds of siege defenses, and usually they come roaring up the siege tower, but for whatever reason, these guys don't want to use this fucking diseased siege tower, and I think I've had enough. I learned this actually not too long ago, that if they're bugged like this, honestly, this is your best thing, your best route to do. And again, that's very unfortunate that this, as the commander, should be on your checklist. Siege tower bugged, destroy with your own axe while you curse Tailworld's lack of recent updates. Maybe by the time you're watching this, there's some amazing new patch that, of course, fixes this and that, and gives us 3 new kingdoms and a huge DLC or whatever the fuck. But as of this point, right, the game still feels like a highly near perfect game that's unfinished, right? That a lot of the difficult parts, Tailworld's either threw their hands up in disgust and said we can't fix it, or they just have some kind of staffing issue or some other reason. Maybe they've just committed to the old capitalism. They've made their money and now they're just going to run. I digress here. We're getting way off subject, which is, the Russian campaign, the siege of Smolensk, the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. And let's get back to some of those central points. Some of these points, of course, I'm going to bring up 3 times because I'm interrupting myself as we're going to force our way up onto this left side. At least now these fucks are using the siege ladders. I've got a bunch of bowl cut fucking birth control haircut militia trying to hold back our juggernaut army here, and we're not about to let that shit happen. These guys are all blocking my axe like their shields, their little tiny wooden shields are made of adamant or whatever the fuck, the strongest material on earth. Fuck you, militia. I'm getting a little irritated because of how difficult this has been. But actually, I'm just going to embrace it, right? Of course, I've created this intentional settings, so I can't really complain about it. More, I'm frustrated at all the bugs, right? Basically, our troops not using the siege tower. We've had to destroy our own siege tower, that's not under your normal list of things you want to do on a siege. All right, so let's see what else. So Napoleon's invading. He thought it was going to be quick, and that's quite frankly because most of the time in warfare, leading up to the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, there was like a template for war. And that is because the very mindset of war started to change right about the Napoleonic era. And I'll cover a couple of different of those. I might talk about this extensively. It kind of depends on how much time there is in the campaign and how much I forget to mention other points, right? But what was starting to happen is that some of the rules were being broken. And if you're like, what do you mean rules? There's no rules in war. There were back then. There were all kinds of rules to war that were sort of loosely followed by participants, right? They would not do certain things. They would not kill officers. They would not poison. They would not assassinate. These things started to change as I get the total militia beat down here. This is incredible. These militia are all fighting like possessed war dogs. So today, of course, we've got World War II and whatnot, Vietnam era. There's all kinds of assassinations and intentional sniping of officers, poisoning the wells, torture. They would do all kinds of things that back then were absolutely a no-no, right? There's just no fucking possible way that you would do some of the things that were unacceptable then that became more acceptable today. The other one that really changed too is just how civilians interfaced with war. Civilians were basically supposed to be free of war. Now, that doesn't mean that cities weren't put to the sword. They were all the time, especially in wars of religion. But up until the late 1700s, when cities were taken over, apart from accidental damage, civilians were, by and large part, sort of given a layer of respect. And that was because they really did think of war. And what I mean by they, the aristocracy, the people deciding how the wars were going to be fought, they really were fighting wars with almost the feeling of like they were a game, right? The English were particularly sort of enamored with the idea that war was a sport, right? And you played the game, and if the other general played better than you, you shook his hand and shit and gave him some territory, but then you came back a year later for the new round, right? Of course, today we have sports that has replaced war, but back then, they didn't need to. They had enough war where you didn't need to invent sports just to not have war. This is unbelievable how hard they are fighting back here. I mean, this has been just a fucking absolutely bloody siege to take Smolensk. And I guess that's appropriate, actually. It's allowed me to ramble on some shit. So enough of the complaining. Look at these militia are still holding out down here. Kill these bitches. Incredible. I love it. Right, so back in the 1800s, there were several things that started to happen that were not really part of war, and frankly, enemy combatants did not know how to deal with them. And one of them was the concept of a guerrilla warfare. That was just not really frequently something that occurred in war, especially throughout Europe where you had all this aristocracy, and they really did treat war like war games where you traded some provinces and some indemnities and shit like that. But the Napoleonic era sort of ushered this in, and a big reason was Spain. 30 seconds on that. Of course, Napoleon effectively tried to take over Spain. He viewed their monarchs as corrupt, weak bitches, which they were. Apologies if you're Spanish. That's just the reality of the late 1700s, early 1800s corrupt Spanish family. There's an amazing quote by Will Durant. You'll see if I can remember it at some point about a portrait about the Spanish royal family. What the fuck? That guy just faked dying. I swear that was a soccer flop. He's playing possum. Get up. I swear this guy's still alive. I mean, he's faking it pretty well if he's faking it. He must have got shot. It looked like he was up one moment and then laid down on his back the next. And just to add to the fun here, we've got some bugged troops. So again, I got to finish the Spanish point. Napoleon invaded Spain, basically said, okay, Spain is ours. In fact, my brother is going to be the fucking king of Spain. It was a debacle, and the Spanish fought back, but they didn't make big armies. In fact, well, they did, actually. They made big armies, and then they got butchered by the French. What they learned is the same thing that, like, the Afghanistan people and other terrorist countries learned, that when you go toe-to-toe with an absolute juggernaut of power like Napoleon, you fucking lose. And the Spanish got blown up repeatedly by Napoleonic armies. So they committed to what's called la guerrilla, right? The guerrilla warfare. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. correct, although my Spanish is no está bueno. So the Spanish effectively committed to some of what is the earliest forms of guerrilla warfare. And it essentially stands for the little war, right? It means warfare on a small scale. You would do little hit and run attacks here and there, and that ultimately would help you win the war. We had to auto fucking resolve this because of those stuck troops. So anyways, so the Spanish committed to this, and this was very new and frustrating. There were, of course, instances of guerrilla warfare, but the Spanish did it on a large scale. And what I mean by that is tens of thousands of troops fighting in small bands all throughout Spain to stop the Napoleonic invasion. What was happening essentially is that these countries being taken over were like, fuck it, we're going to fight by any means possible to prevent this invasion. And that included all kinds of torture and all kinds of other horrific shit. And it essentially caused sort of an escalation in how wars were fought. Now, I want to devastate this city because the true city of Smolensk, of course, was devastated, but I don't want to lose these companions. So we're just going to simulate. For all intents and purposes, Smolensk is devastated here. We'll just use the middle one because I don't want some companion to say, fuck you and your devastation shit. We're out of here. So warfare started to change by the Napoleonic era, and this really started to impact the war with Russia, right? Russians, by and large part, were told that Napoleon was the Antichrist, that this French invasion threatened not just the sovereignty, not just the king, not just Alexander I, but the people itself. They told their citizens, the priests told their citizens, this is the Antichrist himself invading. Now we're going to steal all the food here from Smolensk, right? Just like what Napoleon did, and they did this shit. They would take everything of use and just leave the city a burned out hulk. We're going to take it all because we're going to need this food down the road. So the war with Russia started to get nasty right about this time, right? We're going to say we're sometime toward the end of September or maybe mid-September. It's kind of the end of summer, early fall, and that matches up pretty well with the map. I'm going to have to take a break here and resort these troops. Of course, my units dump giant amounts of troops in the garrison, and we're going to leave 150. That's the rule I've set for myself. So I will go ahead and do that while I finish this little component here, and then I think we'll do a little cutscene or a little editing to save you some of this. The Russians basically started to commit towards a partisan war, and what that effectively means is guerrilla warfare, right? You had the Cossacks, which I'll talk about more, hopefully quite a bit more, but you also had civilians that were effectively militia that were engaged in all kinds of terrorism, effectively what we would call terrorism today, right? They were committing guerrilla warfare against the French because they really did see it as a life and death situation. All right, so a little autosave here. It's going to take me several minutes, actually, to redistribute these troops. So we'll be right back. So 150 troops in Smolensk, keeping up with the rest of the rules of this campaign, right, of these rules that we've set for ourselves. And I'm charting a path now deeper into, I guess, what we will call Russian territory here, right? Russian/Valandian territory as we continue to push on with this campaign. Now, our army's not even full anymore because I had to distribute troops amongst our various different companion armies. Never mind. I'll do upgrades later on here. I don't think I'll waste your time doing this in the middle of a campaign. But we're still, 2,600 troops, 2,600 fighting troops. Napoleon's army after the Battle of Smolensk was in worse shape comparatively, right? If you remember, we started off with roughly 4,400 troops, 2,600, just some quick math. We're looking at about 65% of the original army size. I think Napoleon's army was under half after the nasty Battle of Smolensk, mostly due to disease and desertion. In our case, a lot of it has been due, of course, to loss in warfare. I'm not going to be able to mirror them exactly because obviously different events are happening in this campaign than actually happened in Russia. We're trying to add these couple of armies, but they're days away. Given all the hostile territory they have to trudge through to get here, I'm not optimistic that they're going to arrive. Now we're going to stop by villages here, just like the Napoleonic army would do as well. And just like them, we're going to tell us, give us your troops, give us your food. You're lucky we're not burning the village down. They would give them assignats. I think that's assignats is how you pronounce it, is basically a form of paper money. And in many cases, that paper money that they got for the goods ostensibly bought by the French army were worthless, right? There was literally a term for a long time as worthless as an assignat. I believe I'm pronouncing that right, but again, please feel free to correct me. I don't mind being corrected when I am ignorant. All right, so we continue to process deeper into here, heading to Flintold, and let's talk about some of the different elements that Napoleon was dealing with. One of them was cavalry shortage, right? As horses began to die from lack of fodder, he began to have a cavalry shortage, and that occurred right about the same time as the Cossacks began to harass the French. As the supply line got longer, and I'm just setting up this new guy. This guy's right out of the academy here. This 18-year-old we're adding to the army. He probably won't make any real significant impact in this campaign. Actually, he's definitely not going to make a real impact in this campaign. Just wanted to add him. But all along the supply line, of course, Napoleon had depots and he had cities and towns. I guess they were mostly you would call towns. Places like Minsk. I don't know the exact population, of course, of Minsk in 1812. Few people do. But at these locations like Smolensk, Minsk, and other places, Napoleon put ammunition. He put food. He had bakeries making. There was one place where they were making 60,000 biscuits a day, because again, we've talked about the enormous logistical task of trying to feed 500,000 people, right? We will just say 500,000 at this stage, even though probably half of that or less was actually fighting forces. You've got all the wives and hangers on and whatnot, deserters now pretending to be wives. Who knows what they had, but it was probably a bit of chaos, probably extremely difficult to keep track of a lot of the units that didn't want to be kept track of. But at this stage, no doubt, there were pickpockets, prostitutes, and all kinds of other people mingling, because you can imagine 500,000 people wandering through the wilderness. Not easy to keep track of people. It's not like they had modern technology. So as Napoleon's armies marched, you have to remember too, the army would literally be 20 miles long as they marched. So some parts of the army would be fighting and other parts would be so far away that they couldn't even hear the gunshots of the people fighting, or they could barely make it out and be like, I guess Fourth Corps is up there fighting with someone. Who the fuck knows who it is, right? This is just a giant snake moving its way through the wilderness. Tens of thousands of horses and wagons and people taking a shit by the river. It must have been just an ecological disaster, not to mention just a chaotic mix of humanity. All kinds of officers and pompous people riding in their carriages right next to cutthroats and pickpockets trying to rob those people in their carriage at night, right? You won't be surprised to know that there were criminals and prostitutes and all kinds of stuff like that, right? You just can't keep track of everybody. I think I've made that point. So as they were moving along, their supply lines and their communication lines became elongated. Obviously, the further away you get from Paris, the longer all those supplies and information and resources has to travel to get to you. Again, Napoleon was a master of logistics, but even he struggled to keep things together on this gigantic campaign. We're talking hundreds of miles over really bad roads. And don't forget, and this is a critical point, the Russians are trying to stop you, right? So they have partisans that are attacking. This might be 50 guys who literally, they might not even be on horse, and they would ambush locations and rob guys. They would have Cossacks, which were light cavalry. A lot of them were scouts and the advanced guard for Russian armies, right? There would be a couple thousand Cossacks, sometimes assigned to a large Russian army, and they were their eyes and ears, right? Because you didn't have satellite, you didn't have phones, right? These guys had to literally ride on a horse and go report to the commander, hey, there's a bunch of French people here with supplies, and I don't think they're well defended. We can take it, right? So these Cossacks, combined with partisans, combined with other Russian military elements, were harassing the shit out of the French supply lines, communication lines, doing all the things that you can imagine people would do to try to stop an invader. Now, all along, the French are robbing, right? They're going to villages and saying, give us your shit. And of course, committing atrocities. And the Russians are committing like atrocities. Anytime they caught a hold of a civilian portion of the line that was unguarded, the Cossacks would come in and skewer guys with their spears and stuff like that, right? These Cossacks were not highly sophisticated from a technology perspective, but they were extraordinarily shrewd. Basically, the difference between like a highly seasoned military person from the Afghanistan mountains and a brand new boot who's a Marine, right? He's got state-of-the-art equipment, but no experience. That was often sort of the matchup here, right? Now, of course, the French had very experienced troops, but spread out over a 20-mile salient, and the Cossacks were horsemen. Amazingly, this little army did make it to us, right? So these Cossacks would attack targets of opportunity, and as soon as the French rallied their own cavalry and other different divisions to try to help them, they would vanish. The Cossacks would just vanish in the wilderness to commit their robbery and murder the next day. Now, I killed this little band of I guess they're force bandits, really, mostly just to get them out of the way. I've got an army or two that I'm hopeful is going to be able to join our large host. And just like Napoleon, right, we're trying to clear a path here and keep our forces concentrated. Obviously, it's way easier in Bannerlord. You just got this train-looking thing, and you don't suffer any of the logistical consequences I've already talked about. So the Russians had Cossacks, they had partisans, they're interrupting their scouts, they're interrupting their information. Of course, one of the most important things when you're trying to make decisions is information, and Napoleon probably had a difficult time at periods during the campaign getting good information. They would send several messages, encrypted and whatnot, in whatever ways they could, and of course, some of them would miscarry. They would be attacked by Cossacks, and those guys simply wouldn't be able to make it through. All right, so we are approaching Moscow. I will talk a little bit about an important part here, but unfortunately, there's no battle that's going to happen unless it happens here at the last moment that is similar to the Napoleonic campaign, and that is the Battle of Borodino. This battle must be talked about for a minute because it was so titanic, and I should be able to slip it in here as we trudge our way to Moscow. Before the French forces got to Moscow, the Russian leaders, Alexander, Kutuzov, Bennigsen, Bagration, all of these leaders, eventually various different people in charge, decided we have to make a fight here. We cannot just give up Moscow, the heart of Russia, without at least showing our people that we're willing to fight for it, as much for the morale side as just a practicality side. They knew the French army was probably more skilled, more experienced, but they had a lot of troops and a lot of guns, and so the Russians made a stand at a place that is called the Battle of Borodino. It was one of the most bloody and chaotic and amazing battles. I mean, of course, amazing from just an epic standpoint. It's horrific to think that 75,000 people died in this one-day battle. That was basically a prelude to World War I, right? We're just mass slaughter, right? Case shot and thousands of muskets firing into packed ranks. The Russians took the worst of it, but not by a lot, right? The French certainly paid. Later on, a lot of French people and Russian people sort of talked about it reminiscently, like, man, did our ancestors fight like wolves that day. And they really did, right? The French was a very determined army, and of course the Russians were fighting for their homeland, and so this was a terrible clash between an unstoppable army in Napoleon's Grand Armée and an immovable object, right? The Russian spirit. Needless to say, though, after that battle, the Russians bashed and sort of, well, I guess it's not needless to say. The Russians ultimately did decide, though, that was enough, that they had put enough blood on the field, and Kutuzov, who had been put in charge, I should mention, Mikhail Kutuzov was a one-eyed, savvy, 75-year-old sort of crusty general that the Russians put in charge. He was in charge at Borodino, although ultimately Prince Bagration and some of the other generals played a bigger part. Prince Bagration, incidentally, was killed in the Battle of Borodino, right? He suffered a serious injury, carried from the field, and he died. Similar consequences occurred to the French, although they didn't lose anybody quite of the stature as a Prince Bagration. I mentioned him before. Bagration was a highly aggressive officer, a highly charismatic and strong leader for the Russians, and that was a severe blow. So the Russians took the worst of it. The French certainly got their asses knocked around as well. But ultimately, the Russians retreated, and they gave up Moscow. Of course, in this campaign, and by the way, of course, here we're just fulfilling the food and troop. I better stop, in fact. The food and troop little self-imposed, we'll call this the hardships of war, right? For 2,000 food, we're going to be able to only sustain 50 losses, and because we've been able to raid these villages, almost all of the troops were scrubs, right? So far, we've been able to survive the deserters. I will tell you it's going to get harder. What do I mean by that? Because winter is coming, right? I hate to use the cliche, but as winter comes, I'm going to increase those sort of the rules for that side of game, right? The desertion and the disease, and it's not really going to be the disease, it's going to be the cold, is going to wreak havoc on our army. So here we go, 2,800 troops here, and you need to understand that right before Napoleon entered Moscow, and he did so peacefully, there was a gigantic non-peaceful battle at Borodino. Obviously, I can't make the enemy attack us here as we fight, or at least we siege in the fog. Really cool weather effects with this realistic weather model. But this is not going to be an easy siege, right? There's 1,800 troops here. Rathagund is here. This is one of the high-level nemesis characters I talked about earlier. She's got high medicine skill as well as a bunch of other very high perks. We're going to have to bash our way into this city to take it. Again, I can't make this campaign exactly like the Russian campaign because I can't control the units that are fighting us, right? And I don't want to. I want there to be a little bit of an RNG element. I don't know if all of a sudden behind me here, 4,000 Valandians are going to come in giant armies and pin us in here where we will actually have to defend Moscow. This is obviously potentially going to be different than the actual Russian campaign. I'm trying to think of how much I want to talk about Russia here. It's already been a lengthy episode. I think we will talk a little bit about it. Smolensk is under siege by a single Valandian army, and in fact, that's one of the nemesis characters. So that guy's so badass, he's out there sieging cities by himself. Of course, Smolensk probably has 400 defenders, right? Not a huge defense force there. We burned out Smolensk, but that is actually kind of realistic to what was happening, right? Napoleon was dealing with all kinds of attacks behind his reinforcement lines. He was getting a report of this battle, and the Russians moved here and took this fucking supply depot. They were causing carnage for his various logistical plans. And as I've already mentioned, things are starting to fail. Now, the Battle of Borodino, the French were pretty well prepared, right? When you read reports, they had enough ammunition. Their cannons, their artillery was in really good shape. They had generally slightly better technology than the Russians. I've mentioned that before. Generally, a French soldier was more experienced, and hence they were successful. Of course, they had probably stronger generals as well, with generals like Marshal Oudinot and Davout and obviously Napoleon. The French also had a leadership advantage there as well. So Napoleon eventually occupied Moscow for 5 weeks. However, and this is a critical point, and again, look at her army. Man, I mean, these armies that are in there, they're stacked with troops. So we're going to get this siege on. We've destroyed their counter siege, but I wanted to give you a glance at the troops here before we started. And again, I'm going to narrate a little bit about Moscow at times in this assault. Most of it, actually, because again, you guys have seen me with this juggernaut army, admittedly getting smaller, right? Maybe now it's just a very powerful army, no longer a juggernaut. We've been eating up 1,700 defense forces in siege. Although this is a new twist. In fact, this will make it easier for me to do some historical narratives because I can't see anything. There's fucking a dense fog here. Again, we have the realistic weather mod to thank for this. Thank you, modders. You guys are fucking amazing. Even the amazing modders of RBM, I want to give them a public shout out here. I at times my channel is seen as kind of a channel that's sort of disparaging for RBM. It's mostly because a lot of the people watching, obviously you guys are on console. It'd be sort of jarring to have most of the battles, I think, with RBM. I do try to show RBM in a positive light, but a lot of it is also my own shortcomings, right? I do not have a comfort level using my own unit and just the battlefield mechanics of RBM. And so when I say I don't want to use RBM all the time, mostly I want you guys to understand, mostly it's me. I definitely think RBM, especially with the additional mods you can use with it, has some value in Bannerlord. I think it's exceptionally valuable for people who are struggling with the speed of vanilla Bannerlord. So I just wanted to put that point in there. All right, so these guys are going to absolutely assail this side. Our artillery guys, just like the French, are laying waste to the Valandians. This has been a deadly combo. I've been doing 2 catapults, 2 trebuchets, and then, of course, 1 siege tower and 1 set of ladders. And man, when they try to defend both the ladders and the siege tower location, it's just Immolation City. So I think I'll sit on this catapult and fire some rounds off into the mist, at least until we start killing our own troops. And again, we will get back to the Napoleonic campaign similarities and talk about some of the different things that were occurring, obviously, in that campaign. Again, my fascination with it borders on obsession, because I just think it's this amazing event, right? There's almost no parallel in world history. Just for that many people, that many troops to all be engaged in this gigantic, long, extended campaign like that. And then you add in all the weather effects and the scorched earth and stuff like that. On top of that, of course, the larger-than-life character of Napoleon, who to this stage, to 1812, really was almost a god of Europe, right? This guy was seen as unbeatable, and by all accounts, Russia and the rest of the world was sort of holding their breath, wondering, if Napoleon just takes over Russia, what then? Like, we literally might have the first time in world history, or at least very, very long time history, maybe since the Romans, where someone conquered most of the world. Maybe, I'm sure some of the fellas, some of the Ottomans and some of the other empires are objecting here. I don't mean to offend anybody. I just mean, especially from my Western-centric view, Napoleon was on the edge of world domination with the Russia campaign, and so there was an enormous amount at stake. All right, so once Napoleon entered Russia, some important events happened. As we rush up here with, we're going to rush up here with 4 or 5 divisions and or the 4th and 5th division and a couple archer divisions. I think we can make a puncture quick, especially since for some reason they're reforming. I don't know if they're going to the main gate. Of course, we're pressuring the other side, so a lot of times this happens, right? The enemy's trying to help the other locations that are under siege. I know we're no longer at Moscow, right? We're not in Moscow yet, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Moscow, what's happened in the actual Napoleonic campaign. When they entered the city, Napoleon, of course, was expecting the normal, a bunch of dignitaries and governors and whatnot to come out and essentially kiss his ass, acquiesce, so that they can keep some of their wealth and maybe one of their palaces and shit like that. But there was almost no reception like that at all, right? It was dead silence except for the flames. Very early on, within the first couple days of French occupation, fires broke out, and then more broke out. And so the French came in and they did what they could. In some cases, they would literally blow up houses to try to create fire breaks. They had some capacity early on to stop the fires, but then more and more and more fires started. And so suddenly the French, who were hoping to winter and gather supplies and stay in Moscow for a long time, suddenly they were dealing with a major problem, right? Eventually something like half the city burned, many valuable libraries and other, I don't want to say famous, but of high-profile buildings burned down. Napoleon had some of the ammunition moved out of the city into very safe spots. Of course, he took up residence in the Kremlin, which we've already mentioned. Kremlin basically means, the inner fortress of Moscow. We still refer to it today as the Kremlin, which is kind of curious. So Napoleon was dealing with these fires, and it became pretty early on obvious based on witnesses that were soon executed, of course. I don't know why they would talk after they're, these guys are going to get executed. I wouldn't have told them shit. I would have spat in their face if I were these Russians. But these guys talked and essentially said, look, I was a prisoner. I've been set free and told my freedom is going to be contingent on me setting fires. And of course, there's some people who think that that's kind of not entirely accurate, that the prisoners were just sent loose just to cause carnage, but there's some evidence that the governor, this guy's name was Count Theodore Rostopchin or some shit like that this guy said, we want you guys are free, we want you guys though to basically burn Russia. He was basically willing to not burn Russia, but burn Moscow rather than let Napoleon and his pompous French take it. Again, you have to remember that most of the Russian people felt that Napoleon was essentially the Antichrist. So you're not about to surrender. You're not about to just acquiesce and be like, no, come on and have a cup of tea. Come on in, Napoleon. No, they were like, fuck you. Enjoy your burnt out hulk of a city. And indeed, that's exactly what happened, right? Something like 2/3, 1/2 to 2/3 of Moscow burned. The French were unable to stop it. About the only thing the French did with these burnings is they went around and I'm laughing. It's kind of sad, really. They went around and executed the guys that were accused of burning the city. And of course, they're criminals, so who knows what they did. But that was about all the French could do, is try to round up the people causing the fires, execute them, and then wait for the flames to burn out. I mean, you're talking 1812, and you just moved into a city. It's not like they had any infrastructure, fire trucks and shit like that. That shit didn't work, right? They had incompetent bucket brigades and shit like that. Maybe if you're in a very sophisticated city, you might have a horse-drawn, steam-powered fire engine or something like that in 1812. I think that stuff was just on the fringe of being developed. But needless to say, Moscow burned, and with that, much of the shelter and fortifications and whatnot that Napoleon was sort of counting on to be a saving grace if they decided to stay in Moscow. Now I say if because Napoleon wasn't sure what to do, and we're just doing what I always do here in city defense when there's a giant defense. We're trying to rally a whole bunch of troops here in safety, sort of out of line of sight here underneath this ledge. Get these troops lined up in a big enough force, and then we will start pushing forward and try to push these defenders out of here. They have a line of archers down there just fucking scorching us, and every time I stick my head even slightly over that wall, we get shot. Right, I got arrows pin-cushioned all over my shield already, but I've got more troops here. The troops this time are at least using the siege tower, using the siege tower and the ladders to good effect. On the other side of the battlefield, it looks very bloody. There's a lot of death, but that's okay, right? There's going to be losses here. The key is that we're making almost an unstoppable puncture over here, right? We have like 100, maybe 120 archers and infantry, and we're going to try and blow the enemy troops out of here. All right, so Moscow burns. Revenge is worthless, right? Killing these criminals, it feels good for like 2 minutes, and then you realize you're still in a burning hulk of a city, and you're supposed to stay there potentially for the winter. The reason I say that is because Napoleon wasn't sure, and that was because he wasn't sure what was going to happen next. Throughout, like I said before in this campaign, throughout most of Napoleon's, whatever you want to call it, career as a, can you have a career as a conqueror? Most of his career as a conqueror, most of his time as a general, as a war leader, he was used to a very similar format, a very similar sequence of events that led him to success. That was get the enemy out in the open in large armies, outmaneuver them, crush them in a pitched battle, make them basically cry uncle, totally exert your dominance like a chimpanzee in the forest, and then force favorable peace terms that would give you more space, more land, more troops, more money, all of that shit, and then rinse and repeat, right? Use your generalship over and over again. And this had worked so often that I think Napoleon was kind of foiled by his own success because he had never faced something unusual, as unusual as what the Russians did. I don't think he was well prepared for it. Napoleon, like he often did, right? He wrote up a nice. Napoleon was a highly intellectual, very sophisticated writer and speaker, right? This guy was extraordinarily intellectual. He was highly articulate. He was very capable of flattery and all the other things that I guess we'll call them people with charisma and statesmanship typically have, right? They know who to fucking wink at and who to shake hands with and what levers and shit to pull to get the stuff done they want to get done. He started writing letters to Alexander, right? These two, you have to remember, before 1812, they were sort of quasi-friends, right? In 1807, they had their meeting at Tilsit. They had their peace, and they admired each other. Napoleon definitely manipulated Alexander in 1807. Napoleon was older. He's much more sophisticated. He was probably a greater mind, right? Alexander had some nice attributes, but obviously Napoleon was one of the smartest people, literally, of the last 300 years. Now, he was... Never mind, I won't go into his faults, not now anyways, but he manipulated Alexander, and now, all of a sudden, Alexander was enraged, right? He felt betrayed, his dignity was damaged. Napoleon said negative things about him and his dynasty, said that he had helped his mom kill the people to take over the crown. essentially, these guys had a huge falling out. Needless to say, right? They're fighting a huge war, and at this stage, Alexander wasn't having it. He was not about to give Napoleon anything he wanted. He was willing to fight to the very end. Fuck you, Napoleon. No more dealing. No more. We're not going to treat him anymore like he's a king, like he's a conqueror. We're going to treat him like he's a thug criminal, and so we're not going to respond, right? Alexander was receiving all sorts of dispatches from Napoleon. Hey, we should talk. And, they probably carried a little bit of an air of superiority. Hey, I just took your capital, bitch. You might want to talk to me about some peace plans before I fucking burn your city down. And by the way, your dipshit criminals set the fires. I didn't do that. What a disgrace you are, right? These guys were engaged in a little trolling and a little bullying, 1812 style. So we're just flooding the city here. I think there was just heavy blows at the main gate because our divisions here have just been barreling in here. And I've been able to sustain a fairly decent narrative while we're moving these forces up. There's a massive amount of troops at the gate. So we're not done yet, which is good because I'm not done with my narration. So Napoleon sends out these essentially peace offers, but what they are is come be my bitch offers, right? Come negotiate terms, or more accurately, come surrender, right? Come be a bitch. You can come swear fealty to me at Moscow, your former capital that I now own, and then I'm going to live happily ever after. Napoleon really expected after the seizure of Moscow that Alexander would have to capitulate, that he would have to say, okay, yeah, you win, right? Except Alexander had a mind for a different approach, right? Alexander made no response, and this was intentional. It's very important to understand that Alexander did not say, there won't be peace, there will be peace. Yes, there will be, or no, there won't be. What he did is he didn't respond. Now, remember, that could be interpreted in many different ways. Why? Because you don't know for sure if he received the message. And that might seem strange, right? But think about it. We're not talking, it's not like a cell phone where you can just pick up a cell phone and be like, the motherfucker ghosted me, hung up on me. This is 1812. These guys are sending letters. It's fucking snowing. It's starting to get messy. There's all kinds of war and partisans, people attacking, fucking people carrying messages. You have no idea for sure if Alexander is actually responding, or if the messages aren't arriving, or if he's about to send a peace delegation. And so Napoleon waited. He sat in Moscow, right? They got comfortable. They got cozy there, enjoying the non-burned out parts. They needed rest too. The Napoleonic army at this stage, the Grand Armée, was very beaten up. Very hungry, very sex-starved, very weary, right? They had just marched something like 600 miles, 700 miles. I don't remember the exact distance between Paris and Moscow, but it's a long fucking way to walk, right? On top of that, all the other trials and tribulations. So they needed some R&R, they needed some conjugal visits and stuff like that. So Napoleon said, look, it's the perfect opportunity to rest the army here. We will resupply, right? We're going to take all the food in the city. And despite the fires, there was still vast food. I don't know what that scream was, but that was wild. There was like it sounded like a civilian screaming. Anyways, there was vast food and resources and wagons and horses and shit like that in Moscow. This was a huge city. I fucking slammed that militia to death with my shield here as we wrapped this siege blitz up. We really did blast the Valandians out of this siege. This was a well-defended city, and we just went through this shit like Sherman went through Georgia. I better consummate the deal here before I get fucking shot down at the very end and look like a bitch. But we trucked the Russians, the Valandians, whatever you want to call it. This is probably what it looked like. What it would have looked like had the Russians tried to defend Moscow too. They would have been crushed. Anyway, so let me finish that point because it is very important to what happens for the rest of this campaign and what happened in history. Alexander didn't respond. I'm not going to respond, right? And ultimately, Napoleon spent about 6 weeks in Russia waiting for Alexander to capitulate, waiting for him to surrender. Well, he didn't. And so ultimately, towards, I think it was the beginning of October, I'll have to get the dates and make sure I post them. And this city in the mist, honestly, it looks like Moscow. Look how big that is. It looks like a vast city. 273 dead, we can accept that to take another city here. But of course, we are suffering the war of attrition, right? We're losing 300 here, 200 there. The next thing you know, you're hurting. So Napoleon waited. Ultimately, that was to be a critical component of the entire 1812 campaign. God damn it, we lost another Jawal. In fact, even worse, that's the leader of the Jawal. So he had a large army. We're going to lose even more troops. And of course, his army, I think it'll just stay in the city here. I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. I'm gonna work through this inner keep process here just because there's some chance we lose given... Well, never mind. We're not going to lose. And I'm going to get shot in the face. I don't think Wazuban can duck. I think he's too big. He sticks out like a sore thumb. So I'm trying not to get shot and killed here. I look like a pincushion already. But finish that point. So the Russians abandoned Moscow. The French are hanging out there. Russian civilians and Russian prostitutes and whatnot are handing over STDs to French soldiers left and right. The French are pillaging, absolutely pillaging the shit out of Moscow, right? Like taking religious icons and breaking them for the gold. You can just picture general debauchery on a high scale. Half the city is burned out. It's a mess. There's all kinds of thieves because, of course, the jail was opened up by the governor. Come on out. And the criminals are like, thanks. Now I'm going to rob your fucking palace, dude. There was probably widespread carnage despite the French threat of violence. So Alexander retreated to St. Petersburg. And incidentally, we're going to have a little bonus portion of this. I'm probably going to go on to St. Petersburg. If you didn't notice that at the beginning, that was one of the victory condition bonuses. And what I mean by that is I can go to St. Petersburg here. You can see it's the little red castle just beyond here. And that is effectively sort of simulating where Alexander was. I will have to share these details with you here. We'll take all this food. This is gold for us, of course, because we're going to need food badly in what's to come, right? What's to come is, well, it's the old Game of Thrones cliche, right? Winter is coming, and in the cold, everybody needs more food. You need more supplies and whatnot. It's going to be a challenge. We have this gnarly, big, misty area here that we fought in this battle. And I'm trying to think how I want to do this. We're going to go to St. Petersburg, but I think I'm actually going to wrap this episode up. We're going to finish this just by sort of polishing off where this campaign is and where the French and Napoleon campaign was at the same time. We are heading to St. Petersburg. The French, however, are deciding to leave. Right there at Moscow, it doesn't look like a particularly welcoming place to stay the winter. A lot of the homes are burnt. A lot of the supplies are destroyed because the Russians took whatever they could and burned as much of the rest. Meanwhile, don't forget this critical point. You don't really know how many Russians are surrounding you here. You are hundreds of miles from Paris and reinforcements. No, actually, these motherfuckers are trying to take access to this city. We're going to revote that shit because I need these troops that are in this garrison. Thanks, fellas. But so again, the French decide to leave Moscow and head back. Again, just like before, Napoleon wasn't entirely certain. He wasn't entirely sure where to go. There were some suggestions that they would overwinter in Smolensk and then invade further, maybe even go to St. Petersburg. There were some people that said go to St. Petersburg after Moscow. Make this bitch surrender by capturing his ass. And ultimately, the French decided to leave Moscow and head home, essentially sort of admitting defeat, at least defeat on the goal that they had, right? The goal of getting Alexander to be a bitch to France and capitulate, give them treaties. To this stage, Napoleon had failed, and his conception of what was going to happen was really what failed. So our campaign here, of course, we're going to continue. You want to subscribe if you want to see more. The siege of St. Petersburg is next, right? We're going to take this Alexander by the scrawny little neck. And, of course, he's not actually there. We're just role-playing. But we are going to take St. Petersburg. And then we also are going to leave on this make-believe campaign. So, again, you want to subscribe if you want to see more, friends. I appreciate you, fellas. Please leave comments and all that good stuff. And I will see you guys next time.